I'm Miles Berry. I'm Principal Lecturer in Computing Education at the University of Roehampton. I have a long-standing interest in the use of technology to extend, enhance and enrich education at all levels, from primary all the way through to higher education. I'm also really interested in the way in which we might personalise education, to put the learner right at the centre of the educational process, to acknowledge their choice in the interests that they pursue in what they learn about, and their voice, their contribution to the wider learning community. And it's that I'd like to talk about this morning. I want to start by thinking about the idea of learning as a journey. When we think of learning as a journey, what sort of image, what metaphor do you have in mind there? Is it one thing after another, stages of education that we pursue almost on a conveyor belt, or as if we were all travelling together on the same train? Or is it perhaps one where you have choices to make at different stages of the educational journey there, and opportunities to follow one path or another? I'm curious as to who you think should determine the choice at each of those branch points. Is that something which the learner themselves determines, or is that something which is chosen for them? Or perhaps you have in mind a broader network of interconnected learning opportunities, with the opportunity for the individual learner to pursue many paths, from multiple starting points to lots of different destinations within that connected network of different opportunities. Or perhaps you see the learner as genuinely at the centre of all of this, able to pull from many different resources and opportunities, but always recognising their central place within their own education. If you'll allow me to extend the metaphor, when we look at how they thought of journeys back in the early 19th century, you have maps like this appearing. This is a strip map of the journey from London through to Dover, and it shows you exactly where you go. If you need to get from London to Dover by, I guess, stagecoach at the time, these are the places through which you will travel. Yes, it gives you some information about those places along the way there, but this is really a map which serves one purpose and one purpose only: to get you as efficiently as possible from one place to another place. Well, that was back in the 19th century. Obviously, we think rather differently about journeys now. Or do we? If you type into Google Maps, the directions from Charing Cross in London through to Dover, then you get a very similar sort of thing, without the lovely graphics, to be fair, of here are the different points along your journey, here are the different choices or different routes you're going to have to follow, where you turn left, where you carry straight on, and so on, as you make your way from one place to another place. Of course, Google finds us the best possible route for this. Well, people don't just use Google Maps on the web these days. We have that on our smart devices with their wonderful GPS sensors built in, and this, I think, is much closer to what we have in mind when we think of a personalised learning journey. The device here which knows exactly where you are through the almost miracle of the global positioning system, that knows exactly, as I say, where you're travelling from, and which allows you to choose many possible destinations, and will then find the optimum route through for you from that particular starting point to where you have chosen to go, adapting that route along the way as the traffic conditions change, or as you take a wrong turn, continuously updating the instructions so as to get you to your chosen destination as efficiently as possible. And this is great technology. Who would do without this? But I think it is worth acknowledging that there is a broader context to this, that there is a landscape to explore here, rather than merely a single path or multiple paths to follow, that there is much more to travelling from London to Dover through the landscape of Kent than just getting to the destination as quickly as possible. And some of our most memorable travel experiences are those where we've taken time away from getting through to our destination to explore the places along the route, to explore the places to one side or other of the route, to learn about the landscape, to learn about the place that we're travelling through, rather than just using it as a way to get to our destination. And perhaps some of the best educational experiences are those where we're less focused on just arriving at our destination, our end point, but are more interested in exploring the other avenues, the other possibilities, the other interesting things that occur along that path. And of course, for the traveller, for the learner themselves, the picture is rather different from that which Google gets from its network of satellites as they look down on us. And the path that the individual follows as they travel through to their destination has the byways, has the choices to make, has the opportunity to talk to those who we're travelling with and to explore rather than just getting through to that destination. So for the learner themselves, they have a very particular perspective on where they are at the moment, whereas perhaps for us as educators, we have a higher, broader perspective on the landscape which there is to explore. There, maybe I've tortured the metaphor for too long now. Let's step back or step up from this to think about what we mean by education. What does it mean to be an educated person? One of the most influential thinkers for me personally was R.S. Peters, writing about this. And this idea of the educated person is someone who's capable of taking delight in a variety of pursuits and projects for their own sake, and whose pursuit of them and general conduct of life is transformed by some degree of all-round understanding. I think this is a very, very powerful way of thinking about education, that the genuinely educated person isn't somebody who knows about one particular narrow domain, much as they may have found their passion, but somebody who's been able to pursue their own particular interests, their own projects, their own particular element, as the late Sir Ken Robinson would describe it, who found their niche, the thing that they are uniquely good at, the thing that they are particularly interested in, and had the opportunity to explore that as far as they possibly could for themselves. John Hattie's masterly synthesis of 800 meta-analyses relating to education at school level summarizes his findings in the one sentence you see on the screen there, that the biggest effect on student learning occurs when teachers become learners of their own teaching, and we must acknowledge that teachers have a responsibility to keep getting better at what it is that they do, but also when students become their own teachers, when the student is able to teach themselves something, whereas some of that responsibility for their education is handed over from the teacher to the student themselves, that they learn the skills of being able to teach themselves something. And I'm hopeful that this very strange period has provided many, many of our students with this chance to learn that they can teach themselves something without teachers having to tell them all of this. Of course it's inefficient, of course it's an effective way of doing it, but it's a very narrow approach to education when there are so many opportunities to really broaden that out. I think for me, learning is about connecting the dots, but it's a network of dots, not a single path through these things. That new knowledge only really makes sense when it is connected to our existing knowledge, that we build up our schema by adding new things into this network of connected ideas and connected bits of factual knowledge and their interpretation. That learning is at its heart about making these connections. We can take this down a level and recognize that learning happens by connecting the neurons or strengthening the connections between the neurons within our brains, and recognizing how important that is within the context of learning taking place. But we can also take it up a level and recognize that learning takes place within a community, within a society, and that it's about connecting learners with one another. That is part and parcel of what we try to do in education. So what sort of space does this happen in? I don't think it should come as any surprise that learning takes place in rooms which have largely stayed unchanged for the last 2,500 years, that we bring together people with similar addresses and dates of birth into the presence of an expert, and have the expert pass on something of their knowledge, the knowledge of our generation, to the next generation there. And of course we have dynamic learning environments. We make many opportunities for learners to share ideas with one another, for them to share their experience with each other, and we learn through the conversation as well as through exploration and discovery. Of course we do. And so learning takes place within a community, and any attempt to personalize learning should not detract from that. But it's not just classrooms where learning takes place. Yes, schools have classrooms, but schools also have libraries. And readers and researchers learn too. It's not just pupils and students who are engaged in learning things. And of course, there is an overlap between these groups. The library is very, very different from the classroom. Yes, the grown-up here is in charge of the learning takes place. But I don't think anybody would argue that the librarian in the library is in charge of the learning that takes place within the library environment. That this is about providing access to knowledge, the opportunity to pursue an individual's own interests and explore that and learn from the wisdom distilled from the insights of others into the printed word. What does this look like during this more distant, more virtual experience of learning? Well, within the individual study, within the individual laptop that's there, you have access to both of these things. Yes, we provide access still to the learning community, still to the teacher, the grown-up in the room. But we also, because of the nature of the internet, provide access to all of that content. This extended metaphor of the library is a place where learning takes place. And if one's learning through digital technology, and I think it's really important to recognize how powerful that side of learning is, the learning that would once have taken place in the library is, and how easy the World Wide Web, the internet, makes that for a learner to be able to access this. Deeply influenced by Stephen Downes and George Siemens' work on connectivism as a theory of learning, that yes, factual knowledge of course matters, the knowledge you have at the moment, that existing network of ideas and facts is important, but it's also the ability to connect things to that. And for that, the access to information is much more important than merely what you happen to know at the moment. To summarise this, I think we're at the point now where a young person, your students, your pupils, can teach themselves, can learn almost anything if they are literate, if they're connected, and we must not take that for granted, if they're sufficiently motivated, and if they have the time. The motivation is something which comes from teachers particularly, but from parents and from peers, and indeed from the technology itself. But that willingness to put in the effort to learn something new is absolutely vital to this process. And having the time matters. And I think what we've seen over this very strange period is learners and their teachers having more time to engage with the things that they are interested in, rather than merely following the particular structure of a school's timetable. What role does technology play in all of this? I've hinted at much of this already, but is your idea of the technology-enhanced classroom, of the individualized learning or personalized learning, the technology beaming knowledge into the heads of young people? I would hope not, that this seems a very inauthentic experience of education. This seems a little closer to what we've experienced of late, of content being delivered by the technology, of learners engaging in purposeful activities here. There doesn't seem to be a huge element of either choice or voice in this representation of learning. There doesn't seem to be very much opportunity for the learners themselves to choose their path or to explore a landscape there. Papert, writing back in 1980, a long time ago now, 40 years ago, says that computer-aided instruction typically meant the computer teaching the child. And I think too many think of individualized learning or personalized learning as instruction delivered by the computer. In Papert's vision, and I would say mine, we put the child in charge of the technology. We allow them to use it as a tool to explore their own ideas, to gain their own insights into these things. We've been doing this for a long time before Papert. One of the first uses of the printing press was to print textbooks. And with the textbook, if you're literate, if you've got access to the content, if you've got the time and the interest in learning something, you can teach yourself arithmetic or whatever it is, because you have access to the content and interest in it. Steve Jobs, right at the birth of the Apple Mac, says something really transformative happens with technology when we make the computer something you don't need to be taught how to use, when it becomes a sufficiently simple technology for anybody to be able to use it to teach themselves other things. And when you have one of those to yourself, when it's your own computer rather than a lab of machines that you would have to access on a limited basis. I don't think Jobs got there quite straight away with the early Apple Mac, but perhaps with later devices from the firm that he ran, we see something approaching that early vision of the technology, which is so easy anybody can use it, and where it is an individual personalized device. And Berners-Lee's contribution with the invention of the World Wide Web, and the thing that makes the web special is not the content of this, of individual web pages, not the HTML or even the URLs. It's the little blue links, the A tag in the hypertext, the connections between the pages on one computer to another computer. And again, I come back to this connectivist idea of it's not the individual bits of knowledge, facts that matter. It's the connections between these ideas and the connections between learners which are vitally important to all of this. And folks like Ben Hammersley arguing that the internet, and I think he means the web here, is an educational tool. It's the autodidact's dream. For those who are willing to teach themselves something, access to all of this content, access to this worldwide community of learners becomes a very, very empowering thing. So where do we go from here? Well, Ruth Kelly, then Secretary of State for Education, writing back in 2005, had this vision of the personalised online space, the space that would suggest new content to the individuals who are using it. I don't think we've yet realised that vision in education as a context, but we have seen that sort of thing happening with the likes of YouTube and indeed places like Google's search results of personalizing the presentation of content, that YouTube sucks you down the rabbit hole by suggesting the next video that you should watch, and by having very clever algorithms that demand, that keep our attention, our motivation, perhaps, by providing well-chosen content that follows on, for good or ill. In education, we see this vision of personalised, genuinely personalised learning right at the start with kindergarten, of children able to play, to explore, to experiment, yes, with other learners by pursuing their own interests and projects, but also by finding their own particular areas of interest, that a good kindergarten has a less structured curriculum in which children can, as I say, can pursue their own interests with other people too. We see this at the top end of education. When you study for your doctorate, your thesis is on your chosen topic. Yes, this is something where you have advice and support, where your connections with the scholarly community become increasingly important. But there is that idea of it's your project, it's your research that you're doing. So right at the start, individual projects and pursuits. Right at the end, perhaps, individual projects and pursuit. In the middle, we have a big dip where everybody has to follow the curriculum decided by other people. Perhaps we should find ways of providing something of that kindergarten or doctoral experience through those middle years of education. If you'll allow the anecdote, I think back to my time, I think at the age of 9 or 10, on Thursday afternoons in my primary school, we chose our own topics, our own projects. And for me, this was a seminal point in my early education, of being able to pursue the things that I, as an individual, was interested in. And I hope that some schools are providing the opportunity to do this now. You're seeing some of this. So International Baccalaureate Programme, the diploma programme, has this extended essay of the student themselves choosing what to write their 4,000 word paper about. Yes, supported by their teachers. Yes, connecting to lots of other resources, but their own interests. And we see this in the English education system with the still undervalued, I think, EPQ, Extended Project Qualification, about half of an A-level, but a brilliant preparation for future academic study and a great opportunity for individual students to pursue their own ideas with the support of their peers, with the support of their teachers. If you have access to Wikipedia, if you have access to YouTube, if you have access to Google and the pages that it links to, what else do you need to teach yourself almost anything? These are the places that we turn to when we want to learn something. We are much, much less inclined to turn to the formal education system when we have access to all of this amazing, collaboratively produced, shared content through the online space. The access to that demands access to the device, and none of us should take for granted that young people, students, do not all have access to the tablet or the laptop or even the smartphone with which to access the great resources that are out there on Wikipedia or YouTube or linked to from Google. I was delighted to see that at the start of or towards the start of our pandemic lockdown, the English Department for Education said that they needed to provide, or saw that they needed to provide, access to digital devices for the most disadvantaged in society. I don't know as the execution of the plan quite lived up to its aspirations, but the idea is certainly a good one. What are your education systems, what are your schools doing to make sure that all your young people have access to technology and access to the internet? Let me summarise. When thinking about personalised learning, I think we need to ask, who is it who's personalising the learning? I hope it's not the computer. I hope it's not always teachers who are personalising the learning experience, but there is an opportunity for pupils to pursue their own interest. Yes, given some motivation to do so by their teachers, by their parents, and indeed by the technology itself. I don't think personalised learning means individualised, independent programmes of study, because I recognise that learning has to take place within a community. Those social connections are so important. That good personalised learning should put the learner at the centre of the learning experience, recognising their choice, this idea of rational autonomy, and their voice, that each of them has a vital contribution to the class, to the community as a whole. And there should be recognition for what they're doing beyond school. Things like the diploma programme, extended essay and the EPQ are ways of doing this towards the end of formal schooling, but there are lots of ways of doing that lower down the education system as well, that there's much more to learning than what we capture within a school's planned curriculum. Thank you so much for your attention. If you'd like to follow up on any of these ideas or get in contact with me, my details are on the screen now. Thank you again.